Hello everyone, and welcome to this edition of Dosti Talks. Dosti means friendship and is one of the pillars on which the Australian government wants to set the basis of Australia-India relationship. Yet, it seems that friendship is just not happening. To dig deep into this, joining me today is Neelam, Director of the Lowy Institute's Public Opinion and Foreign Policy Program. Ryan is an experienced diplomat with a strong record of leadership and advancing Australia's interest at home and abroad, and is also the project lead for Lowy's flagship product, an influential annual poll on Australia's attitudes to the world. Thank you for joining us, Ryan.
Pleasure to be with you, Pawan. Thanks for inviting me.
First, tell us about the Lowy Poll. When did it start? What is it meant to do? And how does it shape public and private policy?
Thank you. Well, the Lowy Poll started 2 decades ago now, in 2005, when we first started the poll. The idea was to create a product where we could keep tracking and keep asking questions on Australian foreign policy year after year and track how public opinion was changing and to actually understand what Australians thought about the world. I think before the Lowy Poll existed, there was individual, smaller, more targeted polls on issue-specific things that came up, but there was nothing that was, broad-based that looked at everything from climate change to human rights to conflict and tried to understand how Australians thought about those issues. So really, if I can put it in the most simple terms, the idea was to understand what Australians thought about the world and then to understand how they thought about their place in the world.
How do you conduct the poll?
So every year we use one of the best polling companies in Australia, the Social Research Centre, which is offspin of ANU, and they have a panel, a randomly recruited panel for the poll this year. It was over 2,000 Australians. They go out, they ask these questions, and then when we get the results, they weight it so that the demographics represent the broader demographic profile of the Australian population. So when we talk about these results in this interview, we can be pretty confident that this reflects broadly where the Australian public is as a whole, within a very small, up to a very small margin of error, which is about 2% or so.
So as you said, this is how the poll basically tells us how Australians see the world.
That's right, yeah. And the
does not reflect very well on India, does it, the poll results?
No, and you're right to pick up on that, because it's been a long-standing, finding is that Australian trust towards India has been mediocre, to put it at best mediocre, and when it comes to confidence in Narendra Modi, the leadership, it's also been in that sort of mediocre to lower level.
I'll come to that in a second, but tell me that there's a particular indicator called the thermometer. What does it do, and what's the reference to India in this? Yeah,
so the feelings thermometer was something that the Lowy Institute created to just get a gut reaction of how Australians felt about a whole range of different countries. And we have each year about 15 or so different countries from all different parts of the world on it. And similar to what I was saying about trust and confidence, warmth is also really in that middle range, around the 50s for India.
But it's just above, it's number 6 from the bottom. And the 5 countries below it are Myanmar, China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. So India just being above that.
Yeah.
Why do you think that India ranks so lowly, that it's 6 from the bottom, as compared to be some of what we would think of people of Indian origin here, to be much higher in that list?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, if you look at where it is, which I think is in the 50s range, which is it's kind of moderate warmth, but not very warm. When I look at the spread of countries across the feelings thermometer, it's clear that Australians feel most warmly towards liberal Western democracies. So you've got up the top, you've got New Zealand always comes up
Yes.
up the top. No
Yes.
surprise there. And then Japan does very well. UK does very well. France does very well. And then down the bottom, you have the sort of pariah states. You've got Russia, North Korea. You've got China a bit higher than that, but more recently, China's been closer to the bottom, and countries that are seen as challenges to the international order, if I can put it like that. And then in the middle, you have Southeast Asia. You've got the Pacific Islands and United States, with sort of around where India is, and Indonesia as well. So when I look at that, India has sort of been around the level where Indonesia has been in the public consciousness, which is not a great thing in terms of that has also reflected a pretty mediocre levels of awareness, warmth and trust towards Indonesia, which is another important partner for Australia. So I think there's a shared issue there in terms of
So Ryan,
perception.
you're a former diplomat, 14 years in the diplomatic services. What can be done to raise the temperature in a positive sense between India and Australia?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to familiarity, and when I look at the numbers, what jumped out at me, particularly, for instance, when it came to a question we have on confidence in different world leaders, the don't know figure for Narendra Modi was at the higher end, over 10% of people said that they didn't know who he was, which speaks to a lack of awareness, I think, about one of our most important partners.
But isn't that strange? Prime Minister Modi was in Australia about a year ago, and there were interviews, there was discussions all over the media. So that's a little bit strange that people don't know who he is.
Yeah, I've found that strange. I mean, but I think name recognition compared to Joe Biden, for instance, compared to Emmanuel Macron, there seems to be a lot lower. Now, you can look into that. That's a whole nother conversation about whether there's a media aspect to that. There's an education, but I think there's also a aspect of people-to-people links. Obviously, we have a strong Indian diaspora in Australia, but the challenge there is about broader awareness outside of that diaspora, and I think from the numbers it does look like there is a lower level. But to come to your question about what can we do, I mean, I think it's a multifaceted challenge, and part of it is when you look at the countries that we have stronger trust and familiarity with, Japan, for instance, there's a whole range of engagement across trade, across cultural and tourism linkages, as well as on the security and strategic policy front. Japan is an interesting case study because if you look at that, on all of those fronts, Japan does very well in the Australian perceptions. I think India is probably has less of a history of familiarity with Australians.
But there was a question asked about who are your best friends in Asia, and the countries surveyed were Japan, China, India, South Korea, Singapore, and Indonesia. And India is second last in that list. In fact, China scores more friends where Australia is concerned than India, and this is at the time when China has been a little bit of cold freeze in the diplomatic and trade relations. And it's been absolutely a warm embrace between Prime Minister Albanese and Prime Minister Modi. And yet, the man on the ground, the woman on the streets, they don't want to be friends with India?
Yeah, so look, just a bit of caution in how to read that question, and I'll set out what the question is for your viewers. We ask Australians to say which of those 6 countries they consider their best friend of Asia, and they get to pick one choice. It's not a sort of preferential ranking system, just one choice. And the country that always comes out, or for the last 3 years has come out at the top as our best friend in Asia, is Japan. And that reflects, I think, a warmth, confidence, trust in Japan across a whole range of other indicators we ask in this poll. So just to say, and the bit about caution is in reading this, is that result I see as a lot about our warmth towards Japan, not as much about our dislike or lack of friendship to other countries. And the example is the last country, the country that does comes last on that list, South Korea. I don't see that as a vote of against South Korea. I see it as it doesn't figure as highly in the public imagination as Japan. Now, it's probably a similar thing with India. It's not that people don't feel friendship towards India. It's that they don't think about it as much as Japan as a close partner. You're right to point out that there is familiarity on the cultural front, particularly when it comes to cricket. But I think where Australia-India sort of cultural discourse has been held back is it's really been limited, or it's overly limited to the sports engagement and that Bollywood. That's probably speaking more towards the Indian diaspora community than the broader Australian community. Tourism as well. If we look at Japan and examine why that's so high up, and then we compare that to India, a lot more two-way tourism between Japan and Australia. And then on the economic and trade front, of course, we've seen successive Australian governments try to push Australian businesses to engage more with India. We've looked at investment and why there's very low, relatively low levels of Australian investment into India, and that's been a long-running challenge. But compare that again to Japan, where we've had Japan's one of our largest investors and also one of our largest trading partners, and I think the economic piece looks very different to India, as well as the tourism and cultural engagement piece, which is probably broader than the sort of the familiarity around cricket.
Ryan, in another part of the survey, it seems Australians harbour doubts about Indian leadership. Confidence in Prime Minister Modi's ability to do the right things regarding world affairs has fallen from 44% to 37% this year, and is one of the lowest numbers he's ever had. Why is that so?
Look, the poll tells us what Australian attitudes are, and then why they think it is a matter of interpretation. I'm not going to keep saying that because it kind of applies across all of these results, but just to make the distinction that what I'm going to say here is more about the context rather than what the data tells us. I think it could be any number of factors around it. I mean, we saw Modi come to Australia, so you'd expect a bump in familiarity. But not all of the news that we've seen in Australia about Modi has been positive, right? And you've got to take into account that how people form opinions, a lot of it is through the media. So when we've seen India in the news recently, it hasn't always been for the right reasons. It's been about assassination plots or allegations of assassination plots in North America. But
this survey was done before
the survey was done in March, so that came to light. The Canadian Sikh
but the spies
issue,
one came to light later.
Exactly. So it would have captured the news about Trudeau saying that there was assassination plots in Canada. The nest of spies issue, which the ASIO Director General had referred to, and then I think the Washington Post broke the story that it was Indian, potentially Indian intelligence agencies here. That came out after this survey. But the broader point is there's been a focus on India in the news, but not always for the right reasons. And on the human rights angle, there's also been an ABC journalist who was essentially kicked out of India, focused on sort of the narrowing space for free media, repression of protests and civil society within India. So that hasn't always been positive, despite the fact that on the government-to-government front, there's very much a warming relationship. There's very much the intention on both sides to do more, whether it's trade and economics or the diplomatic security angles of the relationship. All of that is moving towards convergence officially. The public perceptions and conversations sits alongside that and is picking up a range of different signals.
Ryan, there was a question about immigration. About half the population poll think the total number of migrants coming to Australia is too high. about 48%, while the other half said it's just about right, about 40%, or too low, about 10%. There's been a call by both political parties to cut immigration to Australia recently. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, look, the immigration issue has always been a divisive one throughout the history of the poll. We've seen this year, as you say, almost a 50-50 split between those who think it's too low or about right, and too high on the other hand. I think that the public can have conflicting views, or they can hold two thoughts in their minds at the same time. And it depends whether you're asking a question about values or whether you're engaging people on specific questions about their interests. And what we see is that the public are generally more supportive of questions on immigration when it engages their values. So what sort of country are we? How do we identify ourselves? When we put those questions to the public, this year we asked about cultural diversity. 90%, an overwhelming number, said that they saw cultural diversity as important, as good for the country.
Nice.
So there is a bit of a disjunct there between immigration rate as a specific policy issue versus how we see ourselves as a multicultural community, right? And obviously the Indian community is a big part of that multiculturalism. So what would I say? I mean, in terms of the student issue and debates about immigration right now, I think we need to bear both things. We need to keep both things within the frame. So one, that there are divided opinions on how much immigration is good for our economy, for jobs, for infrastructure, but also be very careful that we're not overblowing the links between, or what may or may not be the links between those issues. For instance, we've seen in housing, there's been linkages made on immigration and housing, but we all know that that's a very complex issue, as much to do with supply as it is with demand, right? So we need to be very nuanced and careful about how we treat the immigration debate so that we're not overblowing anxieties about immigrants. And it's clear that the public think that immigrants on the whole have been good for the quality of our democracy and who we are. So students, I think, as a specific issue, it's always, I personally think that the more educational exchange we have, more young students coming here and young Australians going out, the better our relationships with other countries will be into the future. There are questions, of course, around sustainability in universities, funding and how that gets done, and then the quality of education being offered. But at a macro level, I think more education linkages, more young students coming here, more Australians going out, is only a good thing for us.
And that rolls back into the earlier part of our discussion about better awareness, knowledge, understanding between the two countries and the people of both countries.
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick summary about other findings of this poll?
Sure. The biggest changes I think we've seen over the 2 decades of the poll, one on attitudes to China. So you mentioned it before, Pawan, but in the early days of our polling, Australians were more optimistic about China's economic rise. After the very difficult relationship we've had with China from about 2018 onwards, attitudes to China have really plummeted, and we see we've seen more distrust lately than trust, and very high threat perceptions about China's military build-up. Secondly, I think there's always been this ambivalence towards the United States. Australians have this feeling that the alliance with the United States is key to our security, but at the same time they've got these misgivings about where the alliance might lead us. An example is we ask a question, do you think that the alliance makes it more likely that we'll be drawn into a war in Asia? And 75% of Australians said yes. So that's a remarkable figure when you put it alongside 83% saying that the alliance is important to our security. So there's these tensions in the relationships, and I think if you look at those conflicting views with the US, you see it in other parts of our international engagement as well, including with India. There's always different pulls and tensions depending on what issue you focus
They
on.
want to do, so Australians want to see more trade and investment with India.
Yeah.
They're also concerned about religious and human rights issues in India.
Yeah, so one new question we asked this year, because we thought we need to understand how Australians think about India better, we put a new question on the table that said, what are the top priorities in Australia's bilateral relationship with India, or what do you think is the highest priority out of trade and economic engagement, human rights, and defence and security cooperation? And trade and economic engagement came up the top. 42% of Australians said that should be the number one priority. But then 32% said human rights in India, right? So that obviously registers.
Right.
And then 20% only said defence.
Wow, okay.
Now, I find that
That's
interesting.
rather interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when you look at, so part of the Australian government's closer engagement with India is looking at how it plays more of a balancing role in the Indo-Pacific,
Yes.
particularly with the rise of China, and how we work together with other alliances to maintain stability. And there's been a lot happening with India. You know, the government's doing a lot of it, but it's also not speaking as much about it. And I think part of that means that the public haven't really clocked it yet. The public's sort of lagging a little bit behind what is the quickening defence and security cooperation with India. Now, I don't want to overstate it, because obviously India has its own interests and it plays its own interests with China. So there's and in the past we've seen it a little bit more reserved on the Quad, although it's come more into that conversation. But clearly there's a bit of a disjunct between the public seeing India as more of a security partner compared to
The reality.
The reality, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Ryan, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your views. That's a fascinating poll, and I guess people can go and see it in more depth at the Lowy Institute website.
Yes, so poll.loweyinstitute.org. People can explore all of the data over 20 years of polling.
That's lovely. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Pawan.